But our next speaker is John Niemela, and John has a master's and a PhD from Dallas Seminary, and I'll let him tell you about the record he set for getting his PhD at Dallas. And he is with Message of Life Ministries. He's been a Greek professor for many years at Chafer Seminary, and he's a real excellent Greek scholar. And he also is an elder at his church, Grace Chapel, in the southern Orange County, California area. And so he's going to present a paper on the 24 elders, about why it supports pre-tribulationalism. And so, John, take it away.
Thank you.
Shut the doors in the back. Thank you.
Thank you, Tommy. It's a privilege to be here, even if I am lost. And I tend to do that. As Tommy was alluding, in my doctoral program, I probably set a record for anyone except faculty members for the longest amount of time at Dallas Seminary. I started in 1981 and finished in 2000. That was with 2 degrees, so I'm dying in degrees. A little bit about our ministry. We have a website, www.mol316.com. I think it's quite evident how we got that name for the website address, Message of Life, John 3:16. And there will be an edited version of this paper that will appear there at a later point. Let's start here at Revelation 5, but before we do, why don't we begin with a word of prayer? Father, we do thank you for your word, and we thank you for its clarity. We pray that as we open it up, that you will give us insight into it, that we may glorify you by being accurate in our message. And we pray this in Christ's name. Amen. In Revelation chapter 5, we have the 24 elders that are participating in a song that is dedicated, a new song to Christ. But as it starts out, it is a heavenly scene, but it doesn't start out joyfully. John is weeping much because no one is found worthy to take the scroll or to break its seals. But then one of the 24 elders tells him that Christ is worthy to do so. And then, upon hearing that, there is a great chorus or choir that begins to sing, but it's a choir that starts out very small and it grows, and then finally it shrinks back to a small number once again. Now, one of the things that I mentioned in the first paragraph of this paper is the fact that this scroll is written on both sides is an extremely unusual feature, so I'll talk just momentarily about something related to that from my dissertation. This is a depiction of a scribe at work. Notice the scribe works in his lap. It isn't until the 4th century that we find any evidence of any writing desks, and there's considerable material. I've given a lengthy footnote at the bottom of the first page. But observe how difficult it would be to turn the scroll upside down and to write on it when it is the other way. Both reading and writing occurred in one's lap. Now, you might recognize the next scribe. This is a depiction of word processing then and now, but if you look closely, you'll see that that's a Laterno Turnipole there on the screen. But anyway, the issue here is it's going to be very difficult to work with a scroll if it's turned upside down. And so the reader would immediately say, this is an unusual scroll that is depicted in Revelation chapter 5. Well, with that, let's look at the outline points that we're going to need to cover this morning. We need to name the groups that comprise the choir in Revelation 5. Then we will show that there's an antiphonal singing arrangement. Now, antiphonal means give and take. So you'd have one group singing apart, and then you have another group that's singing other words, and there's a give and take between participants within the song. In other words, you don't have everyone singing every word of the song straight from the beginning to the end. It's different members of the choir are singing different portions of it. That's going to be very important. Then we will explore whether there is antiphony within verses 9 and 10 itself. That's going to be the focal point of the paper. Then we will consider textual issues. And I know some of you are saying, textual criticism, boring. Actually, I've got some slides here that should make that a lot more interesting than you think it would be at this point. Then we will apply the antiphonal arrangement that is given to us in Revelation to the song. And then we will draw chronological conclusions. Well, let's look at the groups that are comprising the choir. There are the 4 living creatures, and they are singing in verses 9b and or 10. I'm not at this point going to take a position yet on how much of it is being sung by the living creatures in verses 9 and 10. Notice they also are singing in verse 12b, 13b, and 14a. The 24 elders have essentially the same pattern, with the possible exception of verses 9 and 10 if it's antiphonal. And instead of in 14a, they are in 14b. Then you have a whole multitude of angels that start in verse 12b and also in verse 13b. And then every creature everywhere is in 13b. Notice the only part of the hymn that is sung by all participants is verse 13b. It's clearly antiphonal the way that it's set up, because you have portions of the choir that are singing at times that other parts of the choir are not. Well, then let's look at the seating chart. Now, I could have drawn this as a pie chart. There are a lot of possibilities that this could be, and I have no idea except that it does indicate that they are surrounding the throne. Now, what we have here in blue, let's see, it doesn't really look blue, but turquoise up on the screen, is all creatures everywhere. So that's a huge number. Then we have a multitude of angels. I put them somewhat inside. Then we have the 24 elders, then the 4 living creatures, and then we have the throne in the middle. So as this singing starts, remember it starts with a small group, less than 29, that are very close to the throne, and then it moves out to the multitude of angels, and then it also includes all creatures everywhere. So this starts out, unless there's quite some sound amplification system, as the people at the back are going to be saying, "What are those people singing?" But we assume that there's going to be a great sound amplification system, and everyone's going to hear what is going on in this praise to the Lord. Now that we've looked at who comprises the choir, I'd like to show the antiphonal arrangement. But what we will do here first is to note on page 2 of the notes that we have the Song of Moses in Exodus 15, which shows an antiphonal arrangement. Now, remember, we said that there is definitely an antiphonal arrangement here within Revelation 5, as is depicted up here. But then on page 2 of the notes, we have the Song of Moses and the Song of Miriam. There's a lengthy section in Exodus 15, verses 1 through 19, in which Moses and the children of Israel sang a song to the Lord. Then in verse 20, then Miriam, the prophetess, the sister of Aaron, took the timbrel in her hand, and all the women went out after her with timbrels and with dances. And Miriam answered them. So what she now sings, accompanied by the other women, is an antiphonal answer to what had been given in the first part, the Song of Moses. And so here we have, sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and the rider he has thrown into the sea. Now, I was allowed to use a DVD here that has an antiphonal arrangement of that particular song, but I wasn't able to work it in here. So see me and I can tell you about that particular arrangement. Then we also have Psalm 136, which is another clear indication. We have Group A singers that would start out with, "Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good." And then the Group B singers, "For his mercy endures forever." Group A, "Oh, give thanks to the God of gods." And then the response is, "For his mercy endures forever." And this goes back and forth between two groups through the entire song. In other words, antiphonal arrangements are not foreign to Scripture. They are something that we see within Scripture. Now, one might say, well, what if a passage says they, and it looks like everyone sang? You know, we read the word they and we say they sang Psalm 136, and we'd imagine, wow, everyone sang every single word. That's not necessarily going to be the case. Let's imagine a family of Levites. The father is named Jonathan. The wife is Elizabeth. Their two adult sons, Hezekiah and Uzziah, are temple singers. Hezekiah is in Group A singers, while Uzziah is in Group B singers. Imagine that Elizabeth said to Jonathan, "Did you know that our sons will sing Psalm 136 in the temple next week?" His response to her was, "Yes, they will sing Psalm 136. When I talked to Jonathan, he told me he will sing Psalm 136 next week." Now, we can say that Uzziah sang it, Jonathan sang it, Jonathan and Uzziah sang it. All of those are true statements, but none of them implies that every singer sings every single word. If there's an antiphonal arrangement, they sang the part that they were assigned. And I would see that going on within Revelation 5. Well, now we have to consider the possibility of antiphony within verses 9 and 10 in Revelation chapter 5. Now, there are a couple of textual variants, 3 to be exact, that will concern us. And they are put in boxes, and so we have the alternative readings, whether you have the first reading or the second reading in each of these cases. So it would start out with, "You are worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals, for you were slain and have redeemed," and it may have no word, which is reading A1, and the idea there you would have redeemed those of every tribe, tongue, people, and nation, which I seem to have left out. So there's an implicit object as to who was redeemed, or reading A2 that we're going to argue for in this paper, us. You have redeemed us to God by your blood. Then in verse 10 we have a pair of textual variants, and you have made either them or us kings and priests to our God, and they or we shall reign upon the earth. So what happens here within this is that either the singers are saying that they have been redeemed, that is, you have redeemed us, and you have made us kings and priests to our God, and we shall reign, or there may be another combination. Deciding one textual variant does not decide what the others will read. Let me tell you where I am on this. I favor reading A2, B1, and C1. So therefore I see an interchange between us in verse 9 and them and they in verse 10. So I do see an antiphonal arrangement here within the passage. We'll give arguments for that. Now, again, not every singer sings every word. Now what we can say, even without deciding the textual variants, is that in verses 9 and 10, fewer than 29 singers sing those verses. Remember, we have 4 living creatures, and 24 elders. So that adds up to 28. When I say less than 29, it could either be 4 singers, 24 singers, or 28 singers. I'm not taking a position at this point. In verse 9, it could be 4, 24, or 28 singers. In verse 29, 4, 24, or 28 singers. Then in verse 12b, it becomes a large group consisting of multitudes of angels. And then all creation sings in verse 13b, so it becomes an even larger group. And then it returns in verses 14b and 14c to a very small group. 4 singers in verse 14b. But if you look at verse 14c, it says, the 24 elders fell down and worshipped. Now, I can't imagine worship that doesn't have some sort of communication. Now, it might have been silent. One could argue that. But within the context, this is a new song. I would assume that their worship is audible singing. So that's how I'm posing it, that in verse 14c, they worshiped, but John has not quoted what they sang in their worship in verse 14c. But notice we have a very small group, and then it becomes a very large group, and then at the end it returns back to a small group. An antiphonal arrangement is clear. On page 6, let's again note where we are on the outline. We've looked at who comprises the choir. We showed that there is an antiphonal arrangement within the song as a whole. Now we need to concentrate on verses 9 and 10 to see whether there is an antiphonal arrangement, a give and take between different groups. One group singing one part, verse 9, and another group singing verse 10, or whether both groups combine to sing every word. So, as we look at the issue in verses 9b and 10, the first thing that we need to note is that nothing in these is singing about angels. Whether angels are the singers only, or whether angels and humans are singing verses 9 and 10, they are singing about Christ and about humans, redeemed humans, who will reign upon the earth. So we make note that it is singing about human beings. Now, it doesn't matter which of those textual variants are taken, this issue remains the same. But let's look at how it's worded. It would be antiphony if we have any human singers in this passage. Now, anytime it would say us or we, it would demand that there be human singers, because notice that it would say in A2 that you have redeemed us to God by your blood out of every tribe, tongue, people, and nation. Who but human beings could sing that? If it reads us, it is a requirement that they be humans. Furthermore, although I reject the us and the we readings in verse 10, if those readings were first person, it would also demand that the singers be human. But what we have, as we're going to argue, is an interchange between singers. Now, let's look at how different texts have handled this. When you look at edited Greek texts, they end up taking a position. And there have been 3 positions that have been taken. There are 3 approaches that are evidenced in Greek texts. You'll notice at the right, I refer to a third person implied, because it would be them out of every people, tribe, tongue, people, and nation, and implied them. It's in brackets saying it's implicit because there isn't an explicit word. But then there's an explicit them and an explicit they. That's the reading that Nestle Aland or the UBS text would prefer. The 3-3-3 approach. If you have a King James or a New King James Version, they will prefer the 1:1:1 reading. You have redeemed us, you have made us kings and priests, and we shall reign upon the earth. But if you look at most Greek texts, most Greek edited texts have chosen 1:3:3. The evidence for the readings here is very, very strong. But people have had a difficulty because they say, how do we count for an interchange between us and then them and they? The big problem is people have not really seriously considered the possibility of this being an antiphonal arrangement, just as the rest of the song is antiphonal. I'm going to argue that the text should be understood as a 1:3:3. So the bottom reference, the bottom set, is the one that we will be arguing for. Now let's make note of this. All one has to do is accept any one of the second readings, that is, whether it's A2, B2, or C2, and it would make this antiphonal. Okay, let's explain. You would have humans that would be saying part of it, but then you would have angels that are saying another part. Because remember, we have 24 elders and 4 living creatures. So if one accepts A2, B2, or C2, it is going to demand that the 24 elders be human. And they would be singing about themselves. And then when the 4 living creatures who are angelic would be singing, they would be singing they parts. Secondly, if one accepts A2 or B2 or C2, then the 24 elders would necessarily be human. They would say, you have redeemed us, and we will reign, depending on how many of these readings would be accepted. But in order to have the 24 elders be angelic, one has to reject A2, B2, and C2. All you have to do is accept one of them, and they're human. You have to reject all 3 to make it so that they would be angels. Well, let me show you why there's a reason that this would be important. If the 24 elders are humans, then they are singing in regard to a pronouncement that has been made at the Bema seat. Because how is it that these 24 out of the whole church are going to be reigning as kings and priests upon the earth? In order for these 24 to be selected for that highest of all honors, to be one of these 24 who will be reigning as kings, the Bema has necessarily taken place. But what has to have taken place before the Bema? You have to have the rapture. So, in other words, we would have a sequence that in Revelation chapter 4, verse 1, the rapture, sometime between 4:1 and 4:4, where these 24 would be evident that they had been selected for this role, the Bema would have taken place. The new song is sung in verses 9 through 14, and then in chapter 6, verse 1, the first seal is opened. Now observe, if these elders are humans, it's very difficult for one to work their way around anything other than saying that the rapture has already occurred because the Bema seat has already occurred. In other words, if we have human elders in this passage, this is a pre-70th week rapture demonstration passage. On the other hand, if they are seen as being angels, then one could say that all that's happening here is that the singing is about those who have been selected or who might be selected at some point in the future at the Bema seat to reign as kings. In other words, if these are angels, a person has a lot more wiggle room as far as the sequence of events. But if 24 individuals out of the church have been selected to reign as kings over nations during the millennial kingdom, the Bema has occurred, and if the Bema has occurred, the rapture has necessarily occurred. And this is prior to the opening of the first seal. This becomes a very strong passage in our arsenal if these are human elders, which I will contend. Let's again look at the outline. In our outline, we're going to look at now the textual evidence leading us to determine whether the word us is in verse 9 or whether it is not. Remember it said, you have redeemed out of every tribe, tongue, people, and nation without an explicit object, or you have redeemed us by your blood out of every tribe, tongue, people, and nation. And there it would be the 24 elders saying, Christ has redeemed them out of the multitude of Gentiles, and he has done so by his blood. Well, let's look at the textual issues. Reading A2, that's in verse 9, the us, is favored by strong, extremely strong external evidence. It is also favored by extremely strong internal evidence, although, interestingly, we'll see some people who painted it as though that were weak. On the other hand, it's third-person readings that should be accepted in verse 10. You have made them kings and priests to our God, and they will reign upon the earth. That's readings B1 and C1. They have the strong external evidence, and they have the strong internal evidence. Now I'm going to say just a brief observation. Any Bible you pick up, any English Bible that I'm aware of, is going to take a position that I believe is incorrect on one or the other of the verses. If you have a King James or New King James, they will be correct on verse 9, and they will accept a very poor reading in verse 10, the first and the second reading. If you read any other translation, English translation, they will be inclined to mess up in verse 9 and get verse 10 right. So the problem we have is our English Bibles go with a weak reading either in verse 9 or in verse 10. Well, let's look at how the readings stack up. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the Nestle-Aland text, there is a very useful appendix near the back of this that looks at how various critical texts have approached things. In other words, what they say is, well, when they're standing with one reading and their predecessors have gone another way, they'll tell you what the various predecessor texts have done. And I happen to own all these texts, so I haven't had to rely upon Nestle-Aland to tell me in their appendix what the other texts read, but I'll give a summary. The Nestle-Aland text and the UBS text have third-person readings all the way through, A1, B1, and C1. So under that, with the they and the thems, the 24 elders would probably be angels, if one accepts their reading. But they make note that Merck is uncertain, but is leaning towards having it say, you have redeemed us, in verse 9, but then in verse 10, they and them. So in that case, Merck would say they probably are human. Von Soden, in his text, would say that the us belongs in verse 9, so would-be human elders, but then in verse 10, the four living creatures are singing about the 24 elders, saying, you have redeemed them, you have made them kings and priests to our God, and they will reign upon the earth. Vogels does the same thing in his text. The Byzantine majority text form, that is the text by the second majority text, the Robinson-Pierpont text, also says here that they would be human elders, and the majority text by Hodges and Farstad would indicate that the 24 elders are human. Please observe, this is not a majority text versus critical text issue. Merck, von Soden, and Vogels all are within the tradition of Westcott and Hort. So what I'm wanting to say right here, this is not a majority text versus Alexandrian or critical text issue. The issue here is, are people going to pay attention to the strong evidence that exists in verse 9? The stronger Alexandrian reading and the stronger majority text reading would say in verse 9, you have redeemed us. And so this is not a majority text versus critical text issue. I'm going to make an observation. I'll stick my neck out. I do that once in a while. But there are hardly any textual critics that are pre-trib. And there are hardly any Greek texts that have been edited by people who are pre-trib. And if this passage has the us in verse 9, it's a strong pre-trib passage. And it's very interesting, the amount of resistance that there has been to strong evidence. Now, take a look at the back page of your paper. I couldn't compress all of this onto an overhead, but the overwhelming majority of the Alexandrian evidence favors the third reading, which has the us in it, the word hemos. So both Alexandrian and Byzantine, most of the important manuscripts in both families read with the hemos, the us, being present in verse 9. Now, when you look at that first reading that does not have us in it, the one that's accepted by Nestle Aland and by the UBS text, there is exactly one Greek manuscript, only one that reads that way. And we're going to show that it probably made a blunder, and all of the textual critics have been appraised of its possible blunder, and it's very easy to see that it's likely that it was strictly a blunder. Now, we're going to look at some evidence-weak, pound-the-pulpit harder things that are said by some of the people writing on this variant. Metzger, in his textual commentary, first edition, gave the reading that omits us a C rating, which said not much confidence. Now later, after some of the committee members died, and they put in a few other people into the committee, they revised their evidence upward, even though none of the evidence had changed, and it went up to an A rating. It was strictly a matter of the composition of the committee. But what is written in white here is the part that's talking about the external evidence. Notice what he says. Although the evidence for to theo, that is, omitting the us, is slight. Now that's an understatement. All that there is A and the Ethiopic translation. Now nobody is going to say, wow, the Ethiopic translation supports a reading. If the Ethiopic does anything and there wasn't any Greek evidence behind it, no one would give the Ethiopic a second thought. So it's A all by itself, one manuscript. And everything that's in yellow here is an attempt to say, well, since my main argument that I'd like to go with is so weak, I've got to go with internal evidence. Now, unfortunately, the internal evidence as it's been presented is quite skewed and has ignored the most important of all of the internal arguments. But observe, he admits the evidence for his reading, as far as manuscript evidence, is weak, to say the least. Grant Osborne does the same thing, although he states it a little, makes it so that the reader who's not paying very close attention might think that he's only giving a sample instead of he's giving all of his evidence. Although there is not a lot of manuscript evidence for purchased for God without the word us, that is A in the Ethiopic, and then he goes off into an internal argument. Now, this is something that among textual critics, there should be a newsflash. I mean, this should be front page notices that this is truly astounding what Nestle Aland has done here in their text, and what these people have done when they have argued for a reading that only has one manuscript in its support. Normally, reasoned eclectics, that's the school of textual criticism to which Metzger and Aland and others would align themselves. They normally scoff at a group that call themselves thoroughgoing eclectics. And the big point of contention is the thoroughgoing eclectics say if we can find two manuscripts that read something, it's fair game for it to be the original reading. And normally, the reasoned eclectics say, oh, you're too radical. Having only two manuscripts, the likelihood that it's simply an error is so great that we would never consider, except here, going with one manuscript. So, I mean, under normal circumstances, reasoned eclectics would say going with even two manuscripts would be unheard of, just outlandish. And yet, what they're doing is going with one manuscript. Now, if they can call it preposterous to go with two, what do they say about when they go with one? I mean, this really ought to be a newsflash. But I recognize that most of the people here are not textual critics, and this isn't a burning issue. But this is truly astounding. Now, in Hoskier, and you might say, well, I haven't heard of Hoskier. Well, anyone who's ever written a commentary on Revelation has. And any textual critic has. This is a standard work that was done back in 1929, and to this day it remains the biggest collation of manuscripts that has been published for any portion of the New Testament. It is an extremely important work. And what Hoskier does is he focuses on external evidence. The only place where he mentions an internal argument is in the part that's in the yellow. Notice how the other textual critics were wanting to avoid the external arguments, and they wanted to raise only internal. Hoskier spends most of his time with what do the manuscripts read, and then he has a little section where he talks about what type of an error seems to have been created. The Alexandrine manuscript, also known as A or Alexandrinus, drops the word between two columns. Now that might not seem to be a very significant statement, but it's huge. This is the most important internal argument. And Hoskier brought it to everyone's attention in 1929, so even if people were not looking at a copy of the manuscript Alexandrinus, Hoskier has called their attention to what probably accounts for the textual error. Well, let's look at Alexandrinus. I just happened to bring a copy. Now, what we have in the lower left-hand corner, we have a page here out of Alexandrinus. Notice there are two columns, and I've marked a portion with a green box down in the, well, it looks yellow on yours, sorry, down at the lower left. And that's the bottom of the one column, the first column, and then we have the top of the next column. And then I've dropped in an orange box. What happened was the scribe left out a word between columns. So either it should have gone at the bottom of the first column or it should have gone at the top of the second column. Now, as I look at this manuscript, and I'll point out something that you might also observe, does it not look like the printing is a little darker in the upper right than it is at the lower left? When I look at my copy of the manuscript itself, it appears that the scribe has dipped his pen, gotten more ink on it. So he's taken a little bit of time between the first column and the second column. He probably had a coffee break. Might have even had lunch. I mean, he might have even had a power lunch. I mean, who knows how much time this guy took. And then he starts writing, and he left out a word. And this is the only manuscript that can be adduced that reads this way. And it certainly looks like there's good reason that he might have had a short memory lapse as he's going between columns and apparently dipped his pen in some more ink. Well, let's look at this a little more closely. The one in the lower left is what's at the bottom of the one column, or the first column, and then what's at the upper right is what's at the top of the next column. Well, let's look at it, and I'll put it in English. And redeemed to God by your blood from every tribe, tongue, people, and nation. So that's what is written, and the word us has been left out. A very easy thing to do. He just left out a word. Under a circumstance like this, relying upon one manuscript that there's no way a person could say he didn't leave the word out. How can this be used as the primary evidence that has affected almost every English translation of this passage? The reading is extremely weak on external grounds. There's only one manuscript. But on internal evidence, the likelihood is this scribe just blundered. This reading should be blown away. The us belongs in the text. Because the weight of Alexandrian manuscripts and the weight of the majority family manuscripts, there's no reason to take manuscript Alexandrinus as though it speaks with any kind of authority. There would need to be more evidence before anyone could reasonably say, this is a documented reading that was really intended. This looks like a pure scribal lapse. Well, let's look at what Metzger says in his treatment of his internal arguments. Remember I said that he had a lot of internal arguments, but he left out the most important one. Notice what he says in white. Those who made the emendations, that is, those who put in the word us in verse 9, however, overlooked the unsuitability of us with them in the following verse. Okay, well, let's assume for a moment that Metzger were right. Then why is it that we only have a couple manuscripts that end up changing the readings in verse 10 to say us and we? It's only a couple. Why is it that most scribes would have in verse 9 us And then in verse 10, them and they. Metzger has overlooked the possibility of an antiphonal arrangement. Of the 24 elders, sing in verse 9, that you have redeemed us out of every tribe, tongue, people, and nation by your blood. And then the 4 living creatures respond, and you have made them, the 24 elders, kings and priests to our God, and they, the 24 elders, will reign upon the earth. Metzger says it's unsuitable. And the reason he says it's unsuitable is he hasn't even considered the possibility that the 24 elders sing verse 9 and the 4 living creatures sing verse 10. He has not considered a basic interpretive option. Then if we look at Osborne, he says, if us is part of the text in verse 9, then the 4 living creatures as well as the elders would have been redeemed. He has also overlooked the possibility of an antiphonal arrangement with verse 9 being sung by the 24 elders and verse 10 being sung as a response by the 4 living creatures. They have overlooked the possibility that one group sings one verse and the other group sings the other, even though within the song, that is the way that the song is arranged, where you have greater or lesser numbers of the choir singing different sections of it. Mounts says the most accurate texts omit the first italicized pronoun. Now, I think it's inexcusable that he says texts, plural. How many manuscripts left out the us? 1. But isn't this misleading? The person reads it and says, oh, the most accurate text, plural. Well, maybe he's talking about the most accurate edited text. So maybe he's not talking about manuscripts. Maybe he's talking about his view of Nestle Aland and UBS instead of manuscripts. But one ought to be considering, what does the textual evidence, what do the manuscripts say? Okay, now that we have considered the textual issues, let's apply the antiphonal arrangement to the song. What we would have in verse 9, the 24 human elders that are redeemed would sing, you are worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals, for you were slain and have redeemed us to God by your blood from every tribe, tongue, people, and nation. And then the 4 living creatures would respond, verse 10, and you have made them kings and priests to our God, and they shall reign upon the earth. The outline now leads us to the point of being able to reach chronological conclusions. The Bema seat would necessarily precede chapter 5, verse 9. Because as these elders are here, they've already been commended. They've already been given the right that in the millennium they will reign as kings and priests. The Bema seat has already occurred prior to the point that they start singing. Well, if the Bema seat has resulted in these 24 being selected for the highest rank of rulership, clearly the Bema seat has occurred. If the Bema seat has occurred, clearly the rapture also has occurred. Chapter 4, verse 1 in Revelation would be a statement of the rapture. Then sometime before verse 4 of chapter 4, the Bema seat would have occurred, and a new song is sung in chapter 5, verses 9 through 14. Then Christ opens the first seal. And there's no way that one can play with the sequencing between chapters 5 and 9, because you remember, John started out weeping. Why was he weeping? Because no one was found worthy to open to take the scroll and to break its seals. Then one of the elders told him that Christ was worthy to do so. And then the singing came forth. First you have the 24 elders singing verse 9. Then you have the 4 living creatures responding in verse 10. They are then joined by a whole multitude of angels that sing in verse 12. Then in verse 13, it again goes to a huge group, every creature. Then we have it going back down to the 4 living creatures, and then the final singers are the 24 elders. Under this scenario, with humans singing, human elders singing that Christ has redeemed us, the 24 elders, would have Revelation chapter 5 verses 9 and 10 establishing a pre-70th week rapture. Now, a very interesting thing about this would be the Bema Seat, which I had always thought occurred during the 70th week, would now be something that would occur between the interval of the rapture and the start of the 70th week. But the Lord can work pretty fast. I think that the Bema Seat can be something that He can conduct rather quickly. So I'm not going to get into speculating how long that would take, but it seems to be in the interval. The passage seems to require that it be in the interval between the rapture and the point that the 70th week would begin. Now notice what it said in chapter 5 verse 10. They will reign. This is a pronouncement. They are kings and priests to our God. There's been the pronouncement at the Bema Seat, but the point where they actually reign, the point that they take rulership over these 24 nations, is going to be when Christ establishes the millennial kingdom. And with that, we see that the issue of whether or not the 24 elders are human is indeed an important issue. If they are human, what we have is a strong argument for chronology, because the Bema Seat has necessarily preceded chapter 5, which requires that the rapture would have preceded. But if angels are the ones that are singing it, they could be singing in anticipation of the Bema Seat. So therefore it becomes very important from the standpoint of establishing a chronology that if they are humans, they are singing about the Bema Seat, which necessarily has preceded, whereas if they're singing in general about the Bema Seat, if it were angels singing both verses 9 and 10, then one is left with, well, has the Bema Seat happened? And one could say, yes, it has, no, it hasn't. So we've established who the groups are in the choir. We've shown that different ones are singing at different times. We showed that it's possible for there to be an antiphonal arrangement in verses 9 and 10, of having the elders sing in verse 9 and the 4 living creatures in verse 10. We have considered the textual evidence and have seen that the strong evidence would have the word us present in verse 9, requiring human elders, because you have redeemed us elders. Then we applied the antiphonal arrangement, and we've drawn chronological conclusions. If the 24 elders are humans, we have a wonderful argument for the pre-70th week dating of the rapture. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, John. What are the questions now? How many people here could interact with that Greek text there to ask a question? Okay, here we go. We got one.
My son is constantly arguing with me that we pre-trib people are hiding the rapture because he can't find it in the scripture. Now, I want to know, how can I argue what you said and convince him? Because I don't know all this text.
Get the DVD.
Okay.
I made reference to Revelation 4:1, but I didn't actually quote it here in my presentation. But Revelation 4:1 says, "After these things I looked, and behold, a door standing open in heaven." And then we have a heavenly scene, but the heavenly scene mentions the 24 elders sitting on 24 thrones, and then we have the Bema seat that clearly has already preceded chapter 5, verse 9. So I would say that door opened to heaven and then ending up with all of these 24 who are the top ranked within the church being selected for the position of rulership. How did they get there to be at the Bema seat apart from the rapture? I mean, apart from the church coming to a conclusion. Okay, imagine right now in the football season, imagine if someone were pronounced the Heisman winner. I mean, right now. Wouldn't everyone who lost say, wait a moment, but I was on an upward trend. Look at where I would be by the end of the season. The Bema seat cannot occur before the church has drawn to a close. Otherwise, Christ is saying, sorry folks, you're too late, I'm not going to give you a chance. The Bema seat, for it to have happened, requires that the church age has ended via the rapture.
Yeah, the bride's complete.
The bride is complete.
And then you have the opening of the seals in chapter 6, which start the judgment, and everybody else is saying. And so that's why it's important that the elders are presented there before that happens.
Right.
Well, he can be wrong. Tell him to go back to point number 2.3 LU. You know.
Thank you, Doctor. I really feel sorry for those who had to go. This is a very, very pivotal, very powerful. Dr. Hawking, he didn't deal with the 910 Antiphonal, which I think is a great exegesis that we can now take to congregations, etc. But he said the 24 are symbolic of all. The New Testament talks about, it alludes to Christians being reigning with Christ. It sounds like you're saying there's going to be 24 of the church in that special role, or do you see it as just symbolic or a specific 24 out of the church? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I do see it as a specific 24, and let me give the evidence right within the passage for that. Notice in verse 13, "And every creature which is in heaven and on the earth and under the earth and such as are in the sea and all that are in them, I heard saying." Okay, now, when it says every, can you imagine Satan being there singing this at this point in time? He hasn't been vanquished yet, has he? Can you imagine unbelievers singing this at this point? Okay, what it's saying here with every, as John is looking at it, there's this vast multitude of people who are of beings that are favorable to what Christ is about to become, the one who will open the seals, who will receive the book and who will open it. This is the place where the church as a whole would join the choir. And so when we have 24 here, it's 24, and it really is 24. Because the rest of the church joins the choir, being part of the every creature that has joined this choir in verse 13. When we see numbers, as we were reminded quite eloquently by John Whitcomb in his citation of Dr. Walbert, when we see numbers in Revelation, do we take the numbers seriously or don't we? Now, what I would say here is these 24 have been given the highest rank of rulership. And so even for those who would understand everyone in the church age as being a ruler, which I do not, even if a person holds that view, notice 24 would have the highest rank of rulership. So I'm going to confine myself here to Revelation 5 rather than to go elsewhere to establish the further point, but I would say that the 24 have to be 24 because it's in verse 13 that this is broadened out where it includes the rest of the church and others. Yeah, and as to them being humans, elders is a human term, not an angelic term. They cast their crowns, their Stephanos, before the Lord. Don't they do that in chapter 5? Yes, and about the casting of crowns ceremony, it's a wonderful thing because before an emperor, kings that were under him would cast their crowns, saying, the right that we have to reign is because of you, and then, guess what? They were given back their crowns, and they would reign. So the casting of crowns ceremony, as it was observed, is not permanent, I'll never reign ever again, but it's a recognition that the reign is because of the emperor, Christ. Yeah, and in other words, all the characteristics fit only humans, yes, not angelic beings. And he would have to produce some textual basis, not just his opinion, but textual reasons why these are angels. Also, in the book of Revelation, when they have questions that relate to being saved, they always ask the 24 elders, or one of the 24 elders. Once again, they're representing the saved. The angels, never comment on that when John asks about that.
The basic rules on textual criticism, the shorter reading, the harder reading. Obviously, the omission is the shorter reading, and it seems to be the harder reading, but it almost seems to be too hard of a reading. Did anyone deal with that? Are there other examples where what the object is left out, you redeemed by your blood, but there's never a you redeemed us? That seems to be too hard of a reading and therefore shouldn't have been accepted.
Okay. What happens is actually you've given a wonderful argument against the shorter reading. Let me explain.
Yes, that's what I mean.
Yes.
It seems like that to me.
Right. Okay, let me tell you how it is that people approach verse 9 as far as saying what the object is for who was redeemed. It would be read as, you have redeemed those out of every tribe, tongue, people, and nation. So there's an implicit those understood under the the Nestle Aland reading. That is, if you redeemed out of every tribe, tongue, people, and nation, well then, who was redeemed? people who came out of every tribe, tongue, people, and nation. So the unexpressed direct object would be an implicit those. Now, when people argue for the shorter reading, it is very interesting to read what various ancient authors said about scribes. They complained about how they shortened their text. Now, we've all heard all the arguments saying that longer readings are
more difficult.
Being added because the scribe is going to be wanting to avoid leaving something out. Let's see. Any of you who are familiar with what's called the nomina sacra? That's a set of abbreviations. And even this passage, when I did the collation, which is where you write out what the text is saying for Alexandrinus has nomina sacra. Now, what's nomina sacra? It's the sacred names. But there's a place right in this text where it says, to God, and what he has is the letter theta and the letter omega with a line over it. And that says, with that line over it, I'm abbreviating. Scribes regularly abbreviated. Guess why? They were paid according to the agreed upon number of lines that a book had. It wasn't the number of lines that I produce. It's the number of agreed upon lines. Okay, if you were going to pay someone to copy a manuscript of yours by hand, and you said to them, I'll pay you so many dollars a page, what if they write letters that are huge, and it takes hundreds and hundreds of pages? You'd say, I'm being gypped. You would say, this work has so many lines, I'll pay you the going rate per line, which is such and such, and this is what you're supposed to produce. And guess what scribes did? They said, I can increase my hourly rate if I abbreviate. And the scribes did abbreviate and shorten. And furthermore, on this particular case, what we're looking at is a lapse of memory, a momentary lapse as he goes from column to column. The idea of shorter reading is to be preferred is not the overriding concern in going between columns, especially when no other Greek manuscript evidences this being gone. But furthermore, notice how when we looked at what Metzger said, what Osborne said, what Mounce said, they all overlooked the possibility of an antiphonal arrangement. They said it's making nonsense out of the passage. Guess what? That's an argument against their ultimate position, because what they're saying is, the harder reading is the one that has us in verse 9 and them and they in verse 10. Harder reading, the reading that doesn't evidence a memory lapse between columns, and the one that is documented by the overwhelming evidence of manuscripts from all families is to have the us there. This is not a place where appealing to the shorter reading makes any sense at all. That's a point where they shouldn't appeal to that. That canon has no place here, with it being a between columns omission.
Yeah. When you have a demonstrable, as you did, you demonstrated a very reasonable rationale for why that was excluded, right?
Yes.
That's why that doesn't apply in this situation. That rule, that has to do with other situations, right?
Right.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments? Well, if not, do you have one? I thought I saw a hand. No. Okay. Yes. Okay. You did have one after all. Okay.
Given all your research and what you've discovered, is there any one version of the Bible you would say has got it right?
I am not aware of any English translation that has gotten both verse 9 and verse 10 right. Some of the better editions of the New King James, that is, some that have notes, will have an asterisk in verse 10 at the 2 points and say that the majority text reads them and they.
But the guys doing the New American Standard Bible must have missed it, huh?
Yeah, they followed Nestle Aland, and the Nestle Aland 25, which is what they used, went this same direction of the what I call 3-3-3 view. Third person, third person, third person.
Anyone else?